Voduke. Well anyways, hello and welcome to my review of the Orc Cleaver.
Chop and cleave!
The Orc Cleaver is the only companion who is both a tank and a glass cannon. How is this possible? Well, the only way to find out is to take an in-depth look at his characteristics as a companion. Let's begin with his stats. He has 6 HP, 3 armor, 1 armor regeneration, 5 attack, and 2 speed. There isn't anything extraordinary here. However, it should be mentioned that 3 armor is pretty low. Enemies who are very common can do more than 3 damage. This means that he's at risk of suffering HP damage even at full armor if an enemy gets lucky with its damage range. However, you can use one of his innates to overcome this. The Cleaver's first passive trait is Fortify. This gives him 2 armor when he ends a turn without using a skill, setting his total armor to 5 if he hasn't lost any armor already. This is really handy for giving him the extra armor needed to tank common attacks without suffering HP damage. However, it's still not a good idea to let him take attacks from more than one enemy, so his tanking potential is still limited compared to other tank companions. What Fortify accomplishes is allowing him to become a reliable tank with extra effort. This extra effort is a trade-off for what an effective damage dealer he is, and this is thanks to his second passive. But before going into his second passive, I need to explain his first skill. His basic attack is Sunder. Unlike all basic attacks, it has a cooldown time of 0. The minimum damage is calculated as his attack stat minus 1, while the maximum damage is his attack stat plus 1. So at level 1, it deals 4 to 6 physical damage to an enemy in melee range. It also has an epic effect that grants its attack 2 more damage if the enemy is immobilized. With 4 damage minimum, the Orc can one-shot several basic enemies, but doesn't have the power to guarantee killing anything tougher. When it comes to enemies that have more than 4 HP, he actually still has the potential to kill them in 2 ways. The most important way is with his passive, Counter Attack. The first enemy who attacks him will get hit back with the same attack as Sunder. This only activates once per round, so if the Orc Cleaver is hit more than once, he won't counter those attacks. Once per round means once per the Orc's turn in that round, so after he gets the chance to move and use skills again, Counter Attack is able to trigger again too. This only applies to enemies who are adjacent to him, so ranged attacks or attacks that cause knockback will not work. Although, if an enemy does have knockback, you can purposefully position the Orc against a wall so that he doesn't get moved out of range. This way, he can execute a counterattack even against those enemies. When he attacks, the Orc uses Sunder, so he deals 4 to 6 physical damage on them. This is what I was referring to when I said that there are 2 ways to kill enemies with more than 4 HP. If he lands a counterattack along with his regular attack, then he has dealt a total of 8 to 12 damage. This is how you end up with 8 damage guaranteed on a target, which is the perfect amount for enemies like trolls. The best way to go about this is to move into range of an enemy without attacking them just yet. That way, you get the bonus 2 armor from Fortify. So when the enemy gets their next turn, they move up to the Orc Cleaver and attack him, where he has 5 armor total for protection. He tanks the hit without any risk of HP damage from common enemies. Then, the common enemy gets counterattacked for a minimum of 4 damage, and since the start of their turn has already passed, enemies like trolls won't get to regenerate. When it comes to the Orc's turn, he can then use his basic attack on them, dealing another minimum of 4 damage and guaranteeing their death. While it isn't a one-shot, it is a direct kill without any additional help. This is a better option against trolls than his second skill, which is called Brutal Cleave. This deals 7 physical damage and inflicts knockback, as well as bleed on enemies who are immobilized. Since it does 7 damage, it leaves those trolls with 1 HP remaining, and when it gets to their turn, they will run away instead of attacking. So this doesn't guarantee their death in the same way that baiting them with counterattack does. This is still a useful skill though. The damage calculation is his attack damage plus 2. So if an enemy has enough HP to be finished off with Brutal Cleave, but not Sunder, the Brutal Cleave is useful. I don't find the bleed to come into effect all that often though. If an enemy is already immobilized, chances are that it took damage to become immobilized, so the enemy is most likely ready to die the next time it gets hit regardless. The playstyle of the Orc Cleaver at level 1 is focused on baiting enemies to come attack him so that he can deal extra damage with counterattack, and then dealing further damage with his regular attacks. He can deal some of the highest damage in a single round thanks to this combo. The best part is that this can occur back to back, making him arguably the best unit for outright killing enemies on his own. However, the Orc Cleaver has to be tempered with caution. he doesn't have the tankiness to handle that many enemies. You have to make sure to isolate just enough enemies for him to handle. Usually this means picking them off one by one. That's for the best anyways, since he can only counterattack once per turn. So ultimately, the level 1 Orc Cleaver is an excellent source of damage who also has limited tanking potential. The Orc Cleaver at level 2 though is a different story. He gets to 7 HP and 6 attack. This means that Brutal Cleave now deals 8 damage, which is just enough to one-shot trolls. Plus, look at his armor. It becomes 4 now. This is just enough to comfortably tank many enemies without needing to rely on Fortify. He also now regenerates 2 armor per turn. These stats alone are enough to make leveling him up a pretty decently high priority, but wait until you see his new skills. First, he has Stunning Blow. If you guessed that this attack inflicts stun on an enemy, I'd like to congratulate you on passing your 3rd birthday. This attack does the same damage as his attack stat and also inflicts stun for 1 turn. Keeping an enemy stunned for a turn gives him the breathing room to tank for longer. It can also keep one enemy from doing something that would mess up an otherwise perfect setup for a counterattack against another enemy. So it does give the Orc Cleaver some good options in melee combat. However, it pales in comparison to his second choice. Parry Stance is a self-buff that gives him unlimited counterattacks and -1 damage taken from all sources. It lasts for 2 turns, deactivating once he finishes his second turn since using it. By the time of his next turn though, the ability is recharged and can be used again. So he has almost full uptime for Parry Stance. There's just a small window of vulnerability between his last turn and the turn that the skill will recharge. Parry Stance is a must-have. It defines his playstyle. With Parry Stance, the Orc Cleaver can dish out tons of damage to enemies by counterattacking back to back. With enough enemies in range, he can actually deal the highest amount of damage in one round out of any companion or legend. It's so satisfying. Don't let the unlimited counterattacks distract you from the utility of damage reduction though. This also means that the Orc Cleaver can tank more effectively. Since its damage reduction to all attacks, it makes it more effective the more attacks an enemy deals. The Troll Chieftain, for instance, sends out 3 ice spikes dealing 2 damage each. Now they only deal 1 damage each, halving the damage. Against the Troll Champion, who can deal 2 melee attacks at once, he takes 1 less damage from both attacks. On top of that, because he took 2 melee attacks, it also means he can counterattack that enemy twice. It usually is enough to wipe them out in that one round, which is incredibly powerful for a level 2 unit. Don't forget that Parry Stance's damage reduction applies to magic and true damage too. While I wouldn't recommend using it to tank magic attacks, it is still an option. It outclasses the Stunning Blow completely in my opinion. Stunning Blow is still a good skill, and you don't have to neglect it. I'm sure that after using Parry Stance often enough, you'll feel like spicing things up with a different skill anyways. But either way, Parry Stance and these stat boosts make it a very high priority to level up the Orc Cleaver. If you have him in your party, he should be one of the first units you level up, if not the very first. Now let's talk about the Orc Cleaver at level 3. He gets 9 HP, 7 attack, 6 armor, and 3 armor regeneration per turn. This boost to his durability doesn't cross as many thresholds of survivability, but considering how Parry Stance stacks with his armor, it actually improves his ability to tank multiple enemies by a lot. At this point, he could stand in a group of enemies and execute counterattacks back to back, rather than just countering a handful of them. However, it's not that common for you to get so many enemies in a group like this. Personally, I think that his 3rd level is far less of a priority in comparison to his 2nd level. It doesn't mean it is worthless, just less urgent. But let's go over his skills to see what you can get by reaching level 3. First, there's Whirlwind Strike. This skill deals physical damage to all enemies adjacent to him. The minimum damage is half of his attack stat plus 1, while the maximum damage is half of his attack stat plus 2. It combines nicely with the Parry Stance strategy that I was just talking about. Having the Orc Cleaver surrounded and counterattacking enemies will put them all at pretty low HP, so being able to finish all of them off with Whirlwind Strike is handy. It also deals true damage to weakened targets, but this almost never comes into play. His second level 3 option is Undying Rage. It functions similarly to Azur's Shield of Shadows. It prevents him from taking damage that would set his HP below 1, but unfortunately, it doesn't work against damage over time effects like burning. It can be used to help him tank even more attacks to counterattack them, but at level 3, He has enough armor that it's very uncommon to actually get to the point of needing to protect his HP. So, I find that Whirlwind Strike is better the majority of the time if I'm getting him to level 3 at all. But like I said, it isn't a big priority. His damage already passes a significant threshold of usefulness after getting to level 2, and it doesn't get much stronger once he reaches level 3. It's just a nice thing to get for the orc if you've got experience points to spend. Now let's discuss his synergy. The Orc Cleaver has amazing synergy with Jero Lightseeker. The damage reduction of Parry stance will stack with the Aura of Soul, resulting in -2 damage taken. Of course, this is only for physical damage, but that's just what the Orc should be tanking anyways. He can withstand a lot of punishment this way. Jero's level 3 skill, Marta's Inspiration, adds another layer of damage reduction. This all stacks to make the Orc Cleaver an amazing tank even at just level 2. The same works for Olaf's level 3 Inferno Shield, though it's honestly not a worthwhile synergy to make because it comes at the cost of his summons, which are more useful. Like any melee companion, the Orc pairs best with ranged units that can deal damage while he tanks for them, although the Orc is more oriented on doing all the damage to an enemy by himself. So, I find that it works best to use other ranged companions who are good at outright killing enemies, like the Arcane Wizard and Bruxa, so that you can pick off multiple enemies round by round. Units that lack kill power like the Sorceress don't really pair with him as well. If you have a second melee companion, you can pull off the classic combo of swapping melee units in and out of direct combat so that they can regenerate their armor, or just flat out increase the amount of enemies you can tank by putting both of them in battle at the same time. Since he isn't the most durable tank out there, it can be handy to have another source of blocking power by your side. His epic effects means that he can benefit from the debuffs that his allies inflict. Immobilizing enemies is the most common way to increase the Orc Cleaver's damage output, but it doesn't come up that often, and usually falls short compared to the synergy that you can get out of other characters. I see him as more of a lone wolf, taking out enemies with his own raw strength so that your other troops can worry about problems elsewhere. When it comes to stat boosts, it is a high priority to give him armor upgrades. Damage upgrades are a decently high priority, but he tends to cross the threshold of killing enemies naturally already. Therefore, it should be more urgent to increase the damage of units who needed to cross the kill threshold first. In this regard, the Orc stacks decently well with most units. Armor is rarely a high priority to upgrade, so if you get the chance to upgrade it, the Orc gives you a great place to allocate those upgrades. When it comes to damage though, he opens up space for any other unit to benefit, which is good in its own way, since most every legend can benefit from a damage upgrade more than the Orc does. He has a very low priority for removing exhaustion, so if you have limited cures for exhaustion, it's fine to leave the Orc Cleaver exhausted. His main power comes from counterattack, which isn't affected by exhaustion. As long as he can still counter enemies freely, nothing really changes. When it comes to XP, however, the Orc Cleaver synergy is much more complicated. It is a very high priority to get him to level 2, so much so that it makes the early game tougher when you combine him with units that also need to be leveled up urgently. The Barbarian, Sasquatch, and Bruxa don't synergize with him as well for this reason. Alternatively, units that perform just fine without leveling up synergize with him much better, like Azra and the Ranger. So in the early game, the urgency to level him up can clash with other urgent characters. However, this becomes less of a problem in the late game. Since the Orc Cleaver has a rather low priority to get to level 3, it's easy to combine him with other characters for whom leveling up even higher is more important. If this sounds like a contradiction, it's not. The Orc Cleaver synergizes poorly with characters who also need to get to at least level 2, but only when XP is scarce. So the early game, where you haven't had a chance to level up just yet, or in adventures where you don't get that much XP, he's more of a hindrance. Meanwhile, in adventures where you get more XP, getting to level 2 is less costly because you'll have more chances to level up everyone else as well. So his synergy with XP depends on the situation. Finally, let's discuss his viability in each adventure. He's great in Krumthak's Dominion and Stormcloud's Winter because of how many enemies there are for him to use that juicy counterattack on. In Extra Dimensional Menace, he's great against demons and skeletons as long as they don't stun him. However, he does end up being stuck in the corner pretty often, hiding from enemies like Flarens who ignore armor, so it's harder for him to be in an effective position to kill enemies in that adventure. Then there's Wild Moon. Parry's stance really makes a difference here because of its damage reduction. It allows him to attack Vine Paws from the front without taking damage. This damage reduction also applies to the poison and burning that seems to be abundant here, though that applies to any adventure. Ultimately, I think that the Cleaver is one of the most fun companions in the game, and that's against some stiff competition. But the strategic ways that you can make use of counterattack is just so satisfying to me, especially after getting Parry stance. It's also really fun seeing him kill enemies all on his own. If you can balance the satisfaction of killing enemies with making sure not to bite off more than you can chew, the Cleaver can become the deadliest weapon in your arsenal.